Hello and welcome to another CMMI Tech Talk in our series that provides a brief overview of individual practice areas. In this talk, we shall look at managing security threats and vulnerabilities, MST, one of two practice areas in the security domain. In this video, we shall discuss the intent of this practice area, look at what value it can provide to an organization, and into the individual practices to see how they can be used to improve an organization's security processes. Security is becoming an increasingly important subject as the range of threats that businesses and individuals face grows alarmingly. While a robust approach to security may have traditionally been the preserve of larger organizations such as government departments, defense contractors, or financial institutions, the modern digital landscape now makes it a serious concern for all types of businesses, regardless of size or market sector. The security domain within CMMI provides best practices to help you manage all aspects of your security approach. It consists of two practice areas: managing security threats and vulnerabilities, MST, which provides detailed guidance on how to understand and manage security threat patterns and is the subject of this tech talk, and enabling security, ISACA, which is focused on the overall security approach and has a separate tech talk dedicated to it. Both MST and ISACA fall within the Managing Security and Safety Capability area, which is in the Enabling category. Now, we shall start our tour of MST by looking at the key mandatory model components, the high-level intent and value statements. Intent identifies the security threats and vulnerabilities that could compromise the organization or solution, analyzes the potential impacts, and defines and takes actions to address and mitigate them. Value increases an organization's capability and resilience to identify, mitigate, and recover from threats and vulnerabilities. As the practice area title suggests, and as echoed in the intent and value statements, the concept of security threats and vulnerabilities is central to understanding these practices. So it is worthwhile first looking at what these terms mean in the context of the CMMI model. According to the glossary, a security threat is any circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact organizational operations, including mission, functions, assets, personnel, processes, systems, or brand reputation through unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, modification of information, or denial of service. Whereas a security vulnerability is defined as a weakness in a solution, information system, system security procedure, internal control, or implementation that could be exploited by a threat source. Threats are things that could adversely affect us, and vulnerabilities are the mechanisms through which a threat could be exploited. For example, we might identify that there is a threat that an unauthorized person could gain access to our office without our knowledge and steal equipment or corporate knowledge. This threat might be exploited through many possible physical vulnerabilities in our office, such as unlocked or unguarded entrances, inadequately robust security devices, staff apathy to security procedures, or possibly through the assistance of an insider. Threats are generally ever present, and we protect ourselves against them by looking for the associated vulnerabilities and taking steps to address them. Managing security threats and vulnerabilities provides practices that help us identify the many ways our business could be compromised and outlines ways to address and mitigate these problems to an acceptable level. An organization's approach will be highly dependent on the nature of the security landscape within which it operates. Hence, the specific security threats that a large, multinational investment bank might have to contend with will likely be very different to those facing a small IT consultancy business. The practice summary table shows that the managing security threats and vulnerabilities practices are split across 4 practice group levels: demonstrating the traditional evolutionary path towards increasing capability. The practices at level 1 provide a basic, initial approach to identifying and addressing threats and vulnerabilities, whereas at level 2, this is developed into a more considered, planned, and managed approach that addresses the subject of security more holistically by applying objective criteria to prioritize mitigation actions and focus efforts on the highest risk areas. At level 3, this is taken still further by adopting a more organizational perspective and including activities to improve the organization's security response by evaluating the effectiveness of mitigation activities and looking for organizational-wide mitigation activities. Finally, MST also includes a single level 4 practice which starts to bring statistical and quantitative data analysis techniques to bear on the problem to provide a more proactive and forward-looking security response. Looking at the individual practices, Practice MST 1.1 looks for us to identify and record an initial set of security threats and vulnerabilities. Developing an awareness of the types of security threats and related vulnerabilities we may have to deal with is the first stage in addressing them, and starting to create the foundation of a more considered overall approach. But at this initial level, CMMI is looking in the most general terms for a list of possible issues to consider. Practice MST 1.2 complements the previous practice by seeking to do something about the security threats and vulnerabilities that have been identified. It may not always be possible or practical to mitigate all security threats entirely, but by looking at individual vulnerabilities and then defining a set of security actions to address them, and then planning, implementing, and tracking these actions, we can start to reduce the likelihood of a security breach happening. This is a pattern we encounter a lot in CMMI. Very often, there will be a practice or a set of practices to identify a type of issue and then additional practices to put in place and manage appropriate remedial actions. It is interesting to compare the level 1 practices of MST with the level 1 practices of the associated security domain practice area, ISACA. Superficially, the practices in both PAs seem to follow a similar template, and they are certainly highly related, but you will see that the wording of each is slightly different. ISACA talks about security needs and issues, which implies a slightly higher, more abstract level of detail than the MST focus on threats and vulnerabilities. Similarly, MST 1.2 is a lot more prescriptive in looking for security actions to be taken to mitigate each identified security threat or vulnerability. In contrast, ISACA calls for a prioritized approach to addressing security needs. There is little value in identifying security concerns if we don't do something about them. Each identified security threat could potentially have a significant impact on our business, so we need to take appropriate steps to address them. Consider a situation in your home where a window has been smashed, meaning that anyone could easily enter your property. Identifying the problem is important, but if you don't then call a window repair company to come and repair the window, you're not taking any action to address the identified vulnerability. The level 2 practices build an additional layer of detail upon these foundational practices. MST 2.1 elevates our initial ad hoc level 1 security assessment into a more holistic security approach to handling threats and vulnerabilities. This practice is less concerned with the specific details of individual threats and more focused on a general, consistent approach to handling them. As we can see from the value statement for this practice, the approach should provide us with a mechanism to assess and prioritize security issues rapidly. It is important to understand that all these practices are intended to be implemented continuously. The security landscape within which a business operates is constantly changing and evolving, and consequently, the threats that a business faces will also vary over time. MST 2.1 helps us to manage this changing landscape effectively by providing a consistent approach. At this point, it is worth noting that there is a high degree of similarity between the practices of MST and those of the more general practice area of risk and opportunity management. As with other types of risk, our approach may identify different strategies for handling security threats depending on their perceived severity. We might decide that we need to mitigate a threat as far as possible, but equally, we could choose to avoid it altogether by removing the underlying conditions that give rise to a threat. Or possibly, we might be content to accept the risk associated with certain threats, either because we feel they are unlikely to cause us any issues, or because the impact of a breach in those areas might be relatively inconsequential. MST 2.2 starts to look at how we evaluate security threats and introduces the concept of evaluation criteria to help us evaluate threats and vulnerabilities consistently. Criteria can help us categorize and understand different threat types, which will help us to develop efficient strategies to deal with them. To illustrate the concept of security evaluation criteria, consider some circumstances in which an unauthorized person might gain access to our offices. If they were determined to do so, they could consciously try to overcome the physical security measures we had in place and force their way in. This would be a premeditated act performed specifically to gain access. However, we could also envision a situation where a physical security device, such as a gate, failed, enabling unauthorized people to walk in, possibly without even realizing they were entering a secure area. In the first instance, we might categorize the threat as deliberate or malicious, whereas in the second, we might attribute the vulnerability to a failure of the physical security measures. Hence, we could apply the criteria malicious and accidental to categorize these different types of security risks. In this example, we are looking at criteria that might be used to describe different threat types, but we can also use them to understand other aspects of our security threats, such as the types of individuals or systems that might pose threats, such as staff, external personnel, connected IT systems, etc., and the type of events that might arise as a result of a security breach, such as disclosure of confidential data, interruption to service, theft, or destruction of property, and so on. Once we have identified and applied a comprehensive set of criteria to our identified threats and vulnerabilities, MST 2.3 looks for us to use these to help us prioritize, monitor, and manage our mitigation activities. For example, we might decide that the most damaging threats are those associated with malicious attempts to disrupt our online services, and hence apply more of our effort in trying to reduce the risk in this area than the risk of unauthorized access to an office by faulty physical security devices. And by prioritizing our security action in this way, we can ensure that we are using our limited resources most effectively. MST 2.4 is an introspective practice that looks for us to evaluate how effective our actions to address security concerns have been, and then take appropriate additional action to ensure our security approach is continuously adapting to a potentially volatile security landscape. We can employ many different techniques to help us understand how effective our security regime has been, including process reviews, analysis of security-related measurement data, tests, and simulation. As we hinted when discussing the Level 1 practices, the security environment within which an organization operates is constantly changing and evolving. New threats emerge and old ones go away, so it is imperative that we continuously adapt our approach to ensure that we minimize the risk to our business and to our customers. Now we will turn to the Level 3 practices in MST. At Level 3, the focus is always on an organizational perspective, which is certainly the case here. MST 3.1 is very specifically calling for an organizational strategy regarding security matters. This extends the security approach established in levels 1 and 2 to a more holistic, overarching strategic plan for managing the organization's security landscape. It outlines and covers everything that falls within the responsibility of the security function and might include people, infrastructure, IT and networks, legal and regulatory compliance frameworks, and many other things. Integrating all these different facets of the security approach demands a clear description of the structure, components, and connections between them. Hence, the practice introduces the idea of a security architecture to tie all these pieces together. In many situations, this may also result in establishing a centralized security operations center, SOC. MST 3.2 extends the concept of evaluating the effectiveness of the security approach that was established in MST 2.4. Now, we are interested in a more comprehensive analysis of the results of verification and validation activities associated with security actions to ensure that we are achieving accuracy, comparability, consistency, and validity in the actions we are taking across the organization. This helps to ensure the quality and consistency of the approach. Whereas MST 3.2 is concerned with the analysis of verification and validation data for individual security responses, MST 3.3 extends the concept still further and looks at the effectiveness of the overall strategy, approach, and architecture. This will help the organization understand the effectiveness of its approach in guarding against possible threats and vulnerabilities. Here, we are looking at the extent to which the actions taken to address security threats and vulnerabilities effectively reduce the perceived risk to an acceptable level, and where issues are identified, establishing systemic responses within the overall strategy to bolster our security approach. MST 4.1 is a high maturity practice that further extends our ability to manage our security approach by employing threat intelligence analysis. This is an advanced discipline in which statistical and other quantitative techniques are used to identify, predict, and quantify the threats from potential adversaries and their motivations and intentions in ways that help the organization protect its personnel and critical assets. For more information on MST 4.1, review the Tech Talk that dives deeper into this high maturity practice. These then are the practices of the Managing Security Threats and Vulnerabilities practice area. To summarize this practice area, Managing Security Threats and Vulnerabilities is concerned with the identification, recording, and management of security threats and vulnerabilities, the establishment of an approach to handle threats and vulnerabilities, identification of criteria to categorize and help prioritize threats and vulnerabilities in order to ensure efficient use of limited security resources, the establishment and maintenance of an organizational security strategy, approach, and architecture, and the use of threat intelligence analysis to predict and address security threats. Thank you for joining us for this CMMI Tech Talk. If you have questions, please contact us at support.isaca.org.